In the meantime, there is a court case, and it really depends on who you read here. And I haven't dug into the case too much. It's a case Halbig versus Burwell, or Halbig versus Sebelius. Sebelius, of course, was the former HHS secretary. Now it's Burwell. So you can find it listed as both. It is a challenge to the Affordable Care Act's subsidies. It is based upon the notion that the way the law, the Affordable Care Act, was drafted is that federal subsidies are offered to people living between 133% and 400% of the poverty line. You receive federal subsidies on your health insurance. So this is what basically makes the Affordable Care Act work to the extent that it does. As the law was drafted, it says subsidies are available only to those enrolled in an insurance plan through exchanges established by the state. There was a sense that some states, that few states would not be able to set up an exchange, and that the feds would set up the exchange on their behalf. The plaintiffs argue, essentially, that because there are 34 states that had the feds set up their exchange, and the plaintiffs in this case, the Halbig plaintiffs, are individuals and small businesses in 6 states that didn't establish state exchanges. They said without the tax credits that are offered by the federal government, they could have claimed exemption from the individual mandate penalty because they would be deemed unable to pay for the coverage. In other words, if you cannot afford, even with subsidies, to pay, you are qualified for an exemption. These plaintiffs are arguing they would have qualified for an exemption but for the subsidies. And the subsidies were illegally offered them because the law says the subsidies are available to exchanges that are established by the state, not by the federal government. Now, the wording of the law does not say not by the federal government. If you read someone like Jonathan Turley, who is convinced that the Obama administration has gone rogue in changing laws, and in some instances, maybe he's right. I don't know. It sounds like this is going to destroy the Affordable Care Act. If you read someone else, or look at a quote from Simon Lazarus, who's from the Liberal Constitution Accountability Center, he argues, in order to believe this argument, you have to think that Democrats in Congress said to themselves, we really need to make them set up these exchanges. And I know how we'll do it. We'll do it by saying if they don't, we'll give them the power to vaporize the act. In other words, when you look at the intent of Congress, it was probably just an error in the way that it was drafted, because it was definitely foreseen not that 34 states wouldn't set up an exchange, but some wouldn't set up an exchange, and that the subsidies would still be provided. 2 courts have already thrown out this case, or I should say have ruled on this case that, yes, this is what Congress had intended, and there's no reason to essentially gut the individual mandate for these 34 states. Right now, the D.C. Circuit Court is looking at it. There are 3 judges. 2 seem hostile to the notion that this should be interpreted based upon what is obvious congressional intent. If they rule that these plaintiffs have a case and basically win, then theoretically the Affordable Care Act will collapse, because without the subsidies in the other 34 state exchanges that are run by the feds, and you should know that if you go to any one of these state exchanges in any given state, it's going to look like, I think, the state exchange, right? I'm not sure about that, but I'm pretty sure it's still branded the state exchange. It's just the back end is done by the feds. The next option for the government is to go to the entire court. In other words, this is a three-judge panel. The government can then appeal and go to the D.C. Circuit Court and ask them to hear it en banc. This is the court case that the Republicans did not want to create, did not want the entire 11 justices to be sitting, if you'll recall. And they were stopping any nominees. Once the filibuster was nuked, this court was filled. There's no guarantee that judges appointed by Obama will necessarily side with the government in this case, but it is more likely than the 3 who are sitting on this panel. So keep an eye on this case. Now you understand it. You will hear more about it, particularly if they rule for the plaintiffs.